Well, I'm hoping I don't pass out like our speaker Friday did and left a script, because I told Susan, if I get sick and pass out, you don't have to worry about reading a script, because I just write squiggly notes. And I am going to have problems reading them, because just before I came down from my hotel room, my glasses broke. So I'm hoping that that's just the extent of my issues for this afternoon. So, Blessed Anna Maria Taigi. And John said he didn't know much about her, and he said her name wrong, so I know he's telling the truth. I was introduced to Blessed Anna Maria a number of years ago. My son was 3.5 years old, and he was diagnosed with a brain tumor. And it started at the base of his brain, moved up into his ear, and came out of his ear canal. And that's actually how we found it. Because, he's 3.5, and he's doing one of these things, but he came up to me and said, "Mom, smell my finger." "Where have you had it?" I know you're my first child, but I'm not an idiot. And he said, "I had it in my ear." And I knew right away, it was that mother's gut instinct. I knew right away that there was something wrong. And I did smell his finger, because everybody always asks me that. And it just had that horrible, deathy type smell. So took him to the doctor, and the first doctor just said he had an ear infection. But my gut was totally different. And so I took him to a different doctor, and in ENT, and the ear, nose, and throat doctor. And he told me, "Oh, you're overreacting. You're a first-time mother. He's fine. It's just an ear infection." And so I went to a third ENT who said, "There's something wrong here," and sent me to a specialist. And that's how they diagnosed the tumor. So I had to go through all the MRIs and everything. So I was watching his schedule. His surgery was scheduled for June 6th. And I was watching that previous week. I had been watching EWTN, and there was a priest on, Father Mickey Pentacura, who's now a friend of mine. And he's the vice postulator of Blessed Anna Maria's cause. And he was talking about her and telling stories. And I thought, you know what? She was a mom, and there's not a lot of moms. She had 2 boys, 2 girls. And at the time, I had 2 boys and 1 girl. And I now have 2 boys and 2 girls. And so I looked at her situation. I thought, a mom that's a saint, I can wrap my mind around that one. And I think that's something that maybe I need to learn more about her, because at least her I can try to emulate. So what I decided to do was to pray exclusively to Blessed Anna Maria and ask for her help in my son's surgery. And I prayed that the tumor would be gone. 2 things I learned about that. Prayers need to be specific. I should have prayed that the tumor was gone and never came back, because it came back 6 more times. So you just have to be careful and very specific. So little tip, go big, just pray and ask for it all. So I asked all my friends, I emailed my friends, I called my friends, I wrote my friends, please pray to send them a little prayer. Please pray to Blessed Anna Maria for a miracle. The day before the surgery, we went in for one more scan, and they scanned my son's head because the surgeon wanted to know exactly where the tumor was. And they did one more scan, and you could see it. It was like a little cauliflower type thing coming out of his ear. Pardon me. So you can visually see it, and you could see it on all the scans. The following morning, we showed up because he was a child. They did his surgery first. And we showed up, and the doctor came in, and they mark his ear, it's his right ear, so they put a little mark on his ear. Because the way the surgery was done is this is right after lunch, maybe I shouldn't tell you. Oh, go ahead, she says. Okay, we're all adults here. They make an incision behind the ear, so they circle all the way behind the ear, this way. They pull the ear out of the way, and they went into his brain through his ear canal, because that's where the tumor was coming out. That's the way they went in. So they went through the mastoid and into the brain. So they marked his ear, and we did all the prep. Well, this was actually an adult hospital. It wasn't a children's hospital, because the surgeon said, "You want it done at the children's hospital or the adult hospital?" And I said, "Where are you more comfortable?" Who cares what I want? Where's the better tools? Where's the better crew? Where's the better, And he said at the adult hospital. So we were sitting there, and I was able to, pray with my son, and they allowed me, even though it was an adult hospital, to escort him on the gurney down into the operating room. So I'm in the bunny suit, I had to get all the scrubs and everything I had to scrub in because I was going into the operating theater, and walk down the hall with him. We walk into the operating room, and it was a large room. It was a big, large white room, and they transferred my son, onto the operating table, and then we had told him that they were going to put a little fighter's jet mask on him so he could breathe. And so he wanted me to be with him, so I was holding his hand, and they put the mask on him, and boom, he was out. And so I turned and walked out of the room. Terrified, just terrified. Went out into the waiting room and prayed rosary after rosary, and they told me it was about a 4-hour surgery. So I was going to be there a while. And it was a hard linoleum floor, so I'm thinking, kneeling on this, I was like back in the corner, and I thought kneeling on this is good because I can offer this all up, right? An hour and a half later, the surgeon walks out in a suit and a tie. So, my melancholic raged, and the first thing I thought was the surgery was a success, we lost the patient, an hour and a half out of a 4-hour surgery. And he was in a suit and tie, he wasn't in scrubs or anything. And he said, I don't know what happened, which is not a good way to start. He said, I don't know what happened, we got in there, and there was no tumor. And I was like a charismatic Baptist African American. Praise God! Oh my God, a miracle! And I just not my personality type at all. And he went, it's not a miracle. Sometimes these things just happen. Coincidentally, fallen away Catholic. And I said, then my real personality, my choleric kicked in. I said, well, it's either a miracle or malpractice. Take your pick. I think at that point he started to see the wisdom of my initial reaction. So they took me into post-op, and I was able to be with my son, 3.5 years old, as he came out of anesthesia. And I was there with the nurse, and she's waving the oxygen under his nose, and she's we were kind of talking a little bit, and then he starts to wake up. First thing he says, he rolls over and looks at me and says, Mommy, Jesus gave us a miracle. I'm going to need a Kleenex, so if somebody can find me one. He said, Jesus gave us a miracle. And I said, oh, honey, and I'm a little embarrassed, in front of the nurse. And she said, no, let him speak. She goes, what did Jesus do, Ian? And God love you, thank you so much. Oh, yeah, yeah, it's going to be a long hour. Just give me a little bit. So the nurse asked Ian, she said, what do you mean Jesus gave you a miracle? And he didn't, there you go. I guess I'm a blubberer. About to see. So the nurse asked him, Ian, what do you mean? Jesus gave you a miracle. And he just ignored her, and he kept talking to me, and he said, didn't you see him, Mama? Nope, I didn't. And he said, yeah, he was in the big white room. Of course, he's 3.5, so I'm like translating, right? He did start speaking at 22 months, but, very clear speaker. But he said he was in the big white room. And I said, really? And the nurse is like, where? Where was he, And so he said, no, it was when I got onto the bed and they put the fighter jet mask on me. I turned and looked behind you, and Jesus was standing over by the door. And I said, really? And he said, yeah. He said, and then you turned and walked away. You walked right past him, and he smiled at you. He smiled? Yes, Mommy. Good. Didn't roll his eyes or anything? Good. He said, yeah, he smiled at you. And then he came into the room, and he reached down, and he put his hand on my ear, and my ear got all warm, and then I fell asleep. First time I've told that story publicly. I don't really care to tell it because I don't know, it's really like a private thing. And he spoke about it for weeks. And for him, it was just a normal thing. It was just, oh, it was so nice seeing Jesus. I'll bet it was. Yeah. At least he didn't say anything like, well, maybe if you went to confession and prayed more rosaries, Mother. So I contacted Father Pentecura, the vice postulator that I had seen on EWT, and I wrote him a letter. And as I said, my son's surgery was June 6th. And I wrote the letter on June 9th, which was a Sunday. And the calendar didn't have him. It was just the Sunday of Pentecost type of thing. And come to find out, just coincidentally, that's her feast day, is June 9th. And so he opened the letter and saw that June 9th, it was dated, and read my letter, and he knew right away. He knew right away that it was a miracle. And I do have a first-class relic of hers. We look forward to the day that she is finally canonized. And there's, it's Rome. There's probably something political going on. I'm sure there is. But she is, according to Father Pentecura, she is the only mystic that has been 100% accurate in all of her predictions. The only one. She is absolutely amazing. She was born in Siena in 1769. Her father was an apothecary. He was a pharmacist. And his business failed, so they moved to Rome when she was about 5 or 6 years old. And they lived in the same house in Rome growing up. And her father went to work for a local, he was a servant, he was the porter at Prince Taigi's or something like that, something Italian. And he worked there as a porter. No, I'm sorry, that's Domenico. Her father, he was working as a servant as well. So I'm trying to read these. Okay, here we go. Put on the glasses that are broken. Yes, of course. All right. So she actually went to school, which is interesting because when Blessed Anna Maria's children were of age, she pulled them out of school and homeschooled them because she felt, I say homeschool, but I mean, she felt that they were being exposed to too many bad morals and things in the school system, so she kept them at home. Now, she wasn't an extremely well-educated woman. She finished all of her schooling, and then she herself became a maid. So she went through school, and she met Domenico, and was married when she was around 20 years old. And then Domenico was real interesting, and he's quite a character. Now, knowing Italians, you will say, oh, he's just Italian. But in our culture, his type of behavior isn't normal. Like at Italian meals, when you go to somebody's house that's Italian and they're having dinner and everyone's screaming at each other, it's just the way they are. Well, Domenico was that way. He's just very rough in his manners. He had just a fiery, fierce temper. And at one point, he and Anna Maria were walking down the street, and she was pregnant, and somebody bumped into her, just kind of grazed against her, and he went ballistic and just grabbed a cane and started beating this guy. He would have beaten him to death if Anna Maria hadn't put herself between Domenico, her husband, and this man. So just a fiery, fiery temper. Very coarse manners, and probably why he never got any further than porter at the house that he was working at. And Anna Maria, growing up, said that she was a good girl. It was just average piety, nothing special. Matter of fact, on the flip side of that, she was really into worldly things. She liked really nice clothes. She would save and get the best jewelry that she could find. She liked to have fancy things. She liked going to dances, parties, that type of thing. She liked to go out and be with her friends, kind of in a sanguine type of way. And so she was very worldly, yet pious. So it's like somebody that hadn't quite made that decision to turn their life completely over to God. So nothing special stood out about her. And what's interesting is that Domenico lived to see her canonization process begin, and he testified at it. He went, I didn't say anything special about her. This is my wife, Wait until we get into all the bilocation, or not, and the levitation stuff. I'm like, how did you not notice? Isn't this like a typical guy? No offense to the men, okay. But it was because he was so clueless, but his temper and how things were, and those things are just her day-to-day dealings with him allowed her to grow in patience, in meekness, in humility, and especially forgiveness. She would stay up at night. If he was working late, she would feed the children, put them to bed, and she would stay up and wait for him to come home so that he would have a meal ready for him. And sometimes he didn't get home until past midnight, and she would have a meal, and she would put it on the table. And there were times when he would just look at it and say, "That's not what I want," and smash it off the table. She is not really the patron saint of abused women because she herself wasn't abused. He was just out of control. He never struck her. He never struck the children. He was not verbally abusive to her, although he was verbal. So it's important to note that she is not an example for somebody in an abusive relationship. If, the church does allow civil divorces, and I'm not even talking about annulments, but the church does allow civil divorces for people that, if the situation is dangerous. And I had a woman come up to me once, and I was talking about Blessed Anna Maria in part of a different talk. And she said, well, she's going to be my patron saint because I'm in an abusive relationship. I said, get out. The church doesn't require you to stick around and be beaten. So, that's important to note that she was not abused, but many women who are coming from abusive relationships do pray to her and ask for her assistance. And Domenico himself, he was considered a very pious man. He was a very chaste man, very devoted. And so they had been married for about a year. She was about 20 when they were married. And they were attending some big festival in St. Peter's. And she was, all dressed up in her finery, and she remembers that day specifically because she had a new necklace, and she was so proud of this new necklace that she was wearing. And they were walking around with the crowds, and she brushed up against a priest by the name of Father Angelo, who later was to become her spiritual director. And Father Angelo heard a voice saying, "Look at this woman and remember her. I have destined for her to become a saint, and you will be her spiritual director." It was a year later that they finally met officially. But it was during that about a few months after that incident in St. Peter's, she was praying, and suddenly it just came over her how worldly she was. And she decided that enough's enough. Oh my goodness, I am so sinful, I'm so worldly. Look, I'm so into all these clothes, I'm into all this jewelry, and even though I'm a good mother, she was very chaste, very devoted to her wifely duties. She decided that, oh no, this is not, I need to change my ways. Well, she was so overcome with her sinfulness that she went to the closest church, and she found this line where, they were hearing confessions, and she got into the line and got into the box, and "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." He goes, "I don't recognize your voice. You're not one of my regular penitents. Get out. I don't have time for you." She was like, "But Father, hear my confession, please, please." So she convinced him to hear her confession, and he heard her confession, absolved her, and said, "Now don't come back." And it's kind of reminiscent to her situation because she went through this with a couple of different confessors trying to find a spiritual director. And it's reminiscent of St. Teresa of Avila, who went through a bunch of bad spiritual directors, where it's better to not have a spiritual director than it is to have a bad spiritual director. And so that's Anna Maria's situation. And she was, I forget what she was doing in that part of town, but she ended up going into this church and met Father Angelo. And through the screen, he didn't see her, and he didn't obviously recognize her voice because he hadn't met her and spoken with her. But as she started her confession, the voice repeated to him again, "That's her, that's her." So he became her spiritual director. Actually ended up, as he got older, moving into the house. And he wrote down all of her, because she was busy working. She was taking care of the house. So he was the one that wrote down all of her visions. He wrote down her ecstasies. He wrote down all the observations there in the home and documented everything. And Father Pentecura said that's part of the reason that her canonization process is going so slow, because it's not her handwriting. It's somebody else's handwriting, and it could be their interpretation of what she said. So he's so well documented everything, but much of it isn't being able to be used. But even though 100% of her visions and everything have come true. One of the things, too, that happened when Father Angelo started giving direction to Blessed Anna Maria is she had the saints that she respected, they were all religious. So she started to think, well, I need to emulate and copy what they're doing. And she tried to, like one of these things that she did was she set up a little prayer altar in the home, and she would pray before the altar. But it was on a stone floor in the house, and she would bang her head on the floor until she would bleed, thinking that, and Father Angelo said, you're a mother. That is not what is required of you. Your primary vocation as a wife and a mother is not to emulate a religious vocation. You know, you have penances available to you on a daily basis, just in housework alone. Maybe that's why I avoid it so much. Which is interesting, because we were talking at dinner, I think it was Friday night, and I said that so many people, she was known to be so holy that people would come and want her advice, and they would want her to cure them, because she could cure the incurables with a single touch. And some of these, I hope my battery doesn't die, because that would really cap off the day. Oh, it's working. Yay. Let's see if it's all still there. And then I won't be able to read it. Can't read a thing. But she became so well known in the area that people used to just show up on her doorstep. Bishops, cardinals, et cetera, et cetera. And if she was doing her housework, she would make them wait outside. So you got a cardinal sitting on the bench in the street waiting for her to finish sweeping the floor, you know, because her primary vocation, she knew what came first were her wifely duties. I am so pathetic. I mean, if my girlfriend calls, I'll probably stop doing what I'm doing. Actually, you get more done when you're on the phone. Then you kind of ignore the housework, you know, but because you're doing it, but you're doing something else at the same time. So her devotion to her daily duty as a wife and a mother are what took precedence. And then beyond that, this is just so pretty. And beyond that, she was very involved with the poor, even though they didn't have a lot of money themselves. So she never took away from her children or her family, but she did try to scrimp and save and give to the poor. And the other things she did was she was very involved at the hospitals. So her oldest daughter, Sophie, who actually was also quite a holy young lady, documented much of their visits to the hospitals and all the miracles that would happen when her mother would pass through the hospital. And there was a refugee princess that was in town, and she helped her, and the princess said that, okay, well, what I'll do is I'll send you the oil, because she used oils to bless people and things like that. And so this princess said, oh, in exchange for this gift, I will make sure that you're well supplied with oil. And Blessed Anna Maria told her, well, one day you'll stop doing that, and then your disease will come back. Oh, I'll never stop giving you oil. It's just a little bit. Well, sure enough, money got a little bit tight, and it was a few years later, and evidently the princess forgot and stopped sending the oil and forgot what Blessed Anna Maria had told her, and she got sick and died. The other amazing thing about Anna Maria is that she was given, so she was married when she was 20. She had this conversion experience when she was 21. By the time she was about 23, she started to get, or she received, like one morning woke up, boom, there it was, just above her head and to the right, I don't know why it's always to the right, was a little globe, is how they explained it then. We would understand it better now as a television monitor, where she could see past, present, and future events. And she could see the state of people's souls. She could see missionaries in far lands. So if there was a missionary that was having a problem and she knew the person locally, she would go to them and say, so-and-so that you've got over in the Philippines is in need of this, 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 and this. And at first they were like, Yeah, like we're really going to box it up and ship it there, based on this 23-year-old's recommendation. And then a few weeks later, they'd get a letter from the Philippines. We need this, 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 and this. So then after that, they started listening to her. She would be able to see the state of people's souls. If bishops, kind of like Teresa Newman, if people dressed up as a priest or a bishop to come and see her, she could tell that they were frauds because she was able to know the truth. So she constantly had, and sometimes she said, Lord, take it away. I don't want to know. I don't want to know. And of course, at that particular time, Pius the Seventh was in exile in Fontainebleau, I think is where he was. And she would keep people posted on how he was doing. And she said exactly when he was coming back, and that is exactly when he came back. The future Blessed Pius the Ninth actually had been to her home, and she told him at one point, she said, you need to straighten up your act and get back to the faith because someday you're going to be Pope. So I guess I don't know much about him, but I understand that right at the beginning of his pontificate, he was kind of a liberal, but then he, switched over. And he ended up being the one to beatify her, which is interesting. But some of the things that happened at the hospital are just absolutely amazing. She would run across kids on the street and that type of thing. There's a woman having a fit of epilepsy along the side of the roads, and, everyone's just not looking at her. But Anna just came over, wiped away her face, lifted her up, and then she was completely cured. And also kind of this thing, because she'd spent so much time, on the roads walking, and they go to the market, they do this, they do that. She would help the poor in the streets. And one of the things that they named in her, the process for her canonization is the fact that when other people saw her doing all these acts of charity, charity's kind of contagious. And so that whole area and her community was far more involved in charitable acts. Just by seeing, she never said a word to them, but just by observing her actions. Before we get to the hospital thing, this is one of my favorite stories. This is when the children were first interviewed after Blessed Anna Maria had died. And because she did so many miracles, how could you not know? It was like this one time I remember being at this Bible study with this priest in the Novus Ordo Church when I first came back to the faith. And he said, Mary didn't know that Jesus was God. She just thought it was a regular baby. And I said, you have got to be kidding me. And he said, oh, yeah. I said, you know what, though? If an angel wings down from heaven and says, do you want to be the mother of God? I think I'd remember that. So anyway, so they interviewed the children after Blessed Anna Maria had died. And, everybody in the neighborhood knew how she was and that she was a saint. And so they talked to the children. They said, did your mother ever do anything unusual? No. Did she ever say anything that you found odd? No. Well, did she bilocate? No. Did she levitate? What does that mean? Well, it means that she float up in the air. Well, she did that all the time. And they go, you didn't find that unusual? And they said, we just thought all the moms did that. Because that's all they knew. So she would go into these ecstasies. She'd be sweeping the floor. I don't know what's so ecstatic about sweeping the floor. She's obviously thinking about other things, right? But it's, when they try to teach our children, you do everything perfectly because you're doing it for God. Well, she had done that to perfection, so that she would be sweeping the floor and she would go into these ecstasies and then she would levitate. So the children would come into the house and there's mom up in the rafters again, and they would grab her skirt and pull her back to the floor. We're hungry, we want lunch. So for them, this was normal. It's like Padre Pio having conversations with her Blessed Mother all the time. He grew up thinking everybody else did too, That's all they understood. That's all they knew. I thought that's so precious. And Domenico, the clueless husband, she would go into these ecstasies and he would yell at her, wake up, woman. Take a nap during the day or something, for heaven's sakes, because she would go into these ecstasies at the kitchen table during dinner or something, and she would just kind of blank out, stand there holding the fork, and he's like, you shouldn't be snoozing all the time. I've never seen a wife snooze so much. All the other wives snooze as much as you do. Bless his heart. Do you guys know my bless your heart thing? Yes, okay. No? Oh, I learned this when I moved to Atlanta. I grew up in Michigan, and then I moved to Atlanta, lived there for about 13 years, moved to Dallas, lived there for about another 14 years, and now I'm moving back to Michigan in a couple of weeks. And I moved to Atlanta, and they, first there's the charming accent and the mint juleps and all, but they have this phrase called, they just say, bless her heart. And I didn't realize that actually erases all calumny, detraction, and everything, because women would say, oh, did you see Mary at Mass? She had that blue eyeshadow on that we quit wearing in the 60s, and she had that dress. Did you see that dress with those big flowers on it? Made her look so fat. Bless her heart. So it's like you can say whatever you want as long as you say bless her heart. That means you're really praying for her, so you're not really engaging in detraction or anything. Right. Okay. All right, some of her other things. And Sophie, she was also really good friends. Getting into the hospital. Every time I start to get into the hospital, they are kind of gross though, and we did just have lunch. Every time we get into the hospital stuff, I always think of, she had one of her best friends, who's now just been canonized, St. Elizabeth. I want to say Mara. I can't remember her last name. Great. But they were very, very good friends, and they supported her, or they supported each other. And I think that's something else I learned, how important it is to have good friends. So make sure you exchange phone numbers and emails and stuff while you're here, because these are people who are like-minded, and these are the people you want to keep in touch with, because it's like when I was working in television and thought I was pregnant, and everyone said, well, just get an abortion. These were all my friends at work. Just get an abortion, just get an abortion. And, it eats away at you in your emotional state anyway, so I know what happens to a lot of these girls. If you feel really bad that they're going to these abortion clinics and they don't want to, and it was the same with my situation when I went to the abortion clinic and I was going to get an abortion. I was away from the faith at the time. And everybody there is not looking like they really want to be there. And that's why, is anybody involved in pro-life or praying outside clean? A number of you. Please continue that, because I changed my mind sitting there in the abortion clinic, and it wasn't a pamphlet that was given to me. There wasn't anything said to me, but there were people praying outside the clinic that day. So don't ever think that your prayers are not working, because you don't know who changes their mind and walks out, because that was me. So don't stop, and don't ever think that it's not working. And please continue that. Excuse me. So there I go again. Okay, back to the hospital. The importance of good friends. This is not the hospital. I got the wrong spot on the page. She didn't want people to know that she had this gift of healing, that she was just able to touch people. So what she did was she would either have a statue of our Blessed Mother or Saint Philomena. And when anybody tried to say that she had healed somebody, she said, no, I didn't, it was our Blessed Mother, or no, I didn't, it was Saint Philomena. So I really didn't know much about Saint Philomena when I first heard about Blessed Anna Maria Taigi. So that's when I learned more about her and got more information and got that in our house. And my children, my daughters especially, do now too. Oh, this was the woman, the princely house of Albania. She was dying of cancer in the womb. She was the one that said she would promise to give her the oils. And she was healed, and then she didn't keep up with it, and then she got the cancer back and died. But there was people that were just documented, just walking along the streets, like the epileptic, or people who had deformed legs, or things you could visibly see. And Sophie kind of got used to it after a while, that she would be with her mom, and she would see somebody, her mom would reach down and touch somebody's leg, and the leg all of a sudden was straight. But again, it's something that she got used to. It's like, floating up in the ceiling. And the children just thought that these things happen in a normal, everyday situation. She did die at 4 a.m. on June 9th in 1837, and immediately her cause began. They put her in they sealed her coffin up, and it was sealed in like one of those steel thingies for 18 years. And when they opened it up, she was incorrupt. I show you a picture that I took when I was there. She's at San Cristogano on, wow, someplace in Rome anyway. Anyway, I'll give you the directions. And if you go, don't do what I did. I know now that if you go into the church, and she's in the chapel all the way up on the left-hand side. So I went and I stayed there. I was there for about an hour and a half, and people were in and out, and everybody that happened to come during that time spoke English. And so they went, well, who's this lady? Well, let me tell you about her. And I was able to give the whole story. And I stayed for an hour and a half just sitting there and talking with Anna Maria. And came home and called Father Pentecura and said, I spent an hour and a half with Anna Maria. And he goes, oh, did you go see her stuff? And I said, what stuff? Okay, so if you go, she's in the front left. Go around the back of the altar to the right on the epistle side, and back there, you just kind of knock on the door and they'll let you in. It's her museum of all her personal effects. I was like from here to the wall away from him, didn't even know about it. I thought, man, I was there an hour and a half. You think one of those Trinitarians could have said something. She was also a third order Trinitarian, and she wanted to be buried in a Trinitarian church. So she was sealed up for 18 years, and they opened it up, and it was like they had never closed it. She still looked like she was alive 18 years later. So when you do see her picture, at that point they did put a little bit of wax, like they did with St. Bernadette Soubirous. They put a little bit of wax on her face at that time. But when you see her, it's like St. Bernadette Soubirous. She's perfectly incorrupt, in her hands and everything. So she started the process, Pius IX started the process, and then she was beatified in 1920. And everything else now is kind of stalled. They think because many of her prophecies and predictions were about the council. So they feel that that's probably a lot to do with the fact that she's stalled, and she may be stalled for a long time. So that's another reason I have a real affinity for her. But as a mother and as a wife, there's so many things I could learn from her and have tried to learn from her. Her utmost devotion to her daily duty. Her house was always spotless, mine's not. I seem to find other things to do that just kind of, she always put her children and her husband first, to the point where she's leaving cardinals out on the street. I love that. So anytime a cardinal comes knocking on my door, I just might make him sit outside just cause, Yeah, I'll look forward to that happening. And also how she dealt with her husband. I find this quite intriguing. And I wonder what temperament he was. And Dr. Childs talked briefly about temperaments, and it's one of my favorite topics, that and hormones, which, last year I talked about that and had the whole chart up here, so you can get that tape. But I even asked Father Pentecura, what was her temperament? And he said, I don't know. I would think she was a sanguine, but by the end of her life, you couldn't tell what temperament she was. And I think that's all of our goals, is to get all four of those temperaments, to develop all the good parts of those temperaments and suppress the bad parts of all of those four temperaments, to the point where you even things out. She kept things so well organized at home that she did have time, even though she was homeschooling 4 children, cooking everything from scratch, going to the market to get fresh food every day or two. She still had time to stop and help people on the street. And how many times do we see people on the street and we, walk on past, or, especially in our day and age now where things are so dangerous and you don't know if you can help them. So I'm not saying it's prudent to just stop the car and pull over and help a hitchhiker. But there are areas that we can reach out. Being involved in the pro-life movement. She did not much with the prisons, but she was very, very involved at the hospitals, probably because she had the gift of healing and could heal people. She made time, and she took her children with her. And that's a study I read a long time ago. It didn't matter if the homeschoolers or even the rosary. The thing that mattered for children to keep the faith was that they were actively involved in doing things for other people, actively involved in charity. Just like the neighbors, they saw her charity, it's contagious, and they started doing things as well. So how do we treat each other? And I'm not holding Domenico up as an example at all, but it's how she responded to him, how she responded to each and every instance in her life as a wife and a mother. He had a violent temper. If he knocked things off the table, she didn't say anything. She picked it up and said, well, what do you want then? Because she was Italian. I'm sure she didn't just sit there and take it. So these types of examples, and again, we're not called to accept abuse, but these are the types of examples that we can pull on. And Father Pentecura is in the process, there's that book, Wife, Mother, Mystic. He's given me a lot of these stories and a lot of this information from books that are written in Italian. Because this one, I think Wife, Mother, Mystic, I think it was originally written in French, translated into Italian, and then that Italian version was translated into English. So there's actually a couple mistakes in there. So how she never dressed frumpy, she always dressed plainly. She insisted on modesty for her daughters. She homeschooled. She wanted to make sure they didn't get corrupted by not only the school system. And think about what was going on. That was the late 1700s. There was a lot going on in that time. She died in 1837. So what can we do as moms? And sometimes we think that it has to be this big grandiose thing, when really the most important thing we do is our daily duty. So I had to analyze for myself how I avoid that and what I can be doing better in that situation. So anyway, that's her life, that's her story. I do want to leave time for a bit of a break before Father Gruner starts at 3 o'clock. And I do hope that you'll stop by. I'll have the picture of her back at my table. Oh, and I think I have one of those sets. I've got some books. I did call my children at 5 after 1. Told them I'd call them at 1. I called them at 5 after 1, and I have a situation at home, so I'm going to have to be leaving within an hour or two. But I will still have some books. And then I reprinted some books that were printed actually in the mid-1800s. They're meditation books. And it was written by a very holy French priest, Father Hammond, not Hammond, Hamon. And they're a meditation for every day. So you have a nighttime reflection the night before and then the morning meditation. And what it does is it focuses on one particular virtue at a time, and it just hammers away at that from all sorts of different angles for about a week or so. And then it'll move on to something else. And then so it follows the liturgical year, but each day is focused, or each week is focused on developing a new virtue. So I have those reprinted. We did the whole re-layout and the whole shot. They've been out of print for over 100 years because nobody could find the 5th book. And I was actually helping a woman whose husband had died. I was helping her pack up a bunch of things, and lo and behold, this book fell out and landed on my foot. And I went, oh my, there's volume 5. So it's been out of print for that long because it hasn't been available. So it's now available, and I have that back there. But I thank you for your attention. I thank you for your Kleenex. And please pray for me and my family situation. And that's about all I can say about that. So God bless you, and thanks for coming.
Pray a great deal and make sacrifices for sinners, for many souls go to hell because they have no one to make sacrifices and pray for them.
Our Lord said to Sister Lucia of Fatima, "The sacrifice that each one can make is to do his duty and obey my law. That is the form of penance I now demand."
The Blessed Virgin gave us a message how to have world peace, that only she can help us. But perhaps we don't get enough perspective. We say, well, nothing dramatic has happened. And it's because our commentators, our newspapers, our editor writers, the people that we really pay attention to, the people that speak on television, in the mainstream press and so forth, people who are under the pay of the enemy often, have yet to point out to us that since we have despised Our Lady's message as the human family, we've despised it, there have been 1,686,570,000 violent deaths as a direct result of ignoring Our Lady of Fatima. That is, again, 1 billion. That is 1 with 9 zeros after it, plus another 686 million people who have died violently for the one simple reason that we've ignored Our Lady of Fatima. We could point out, perhaps another time, that if this is not enough perspective to give us that in these 95 years of ignoring Our Lady of Fatima, we have paid a tremendous price. But as bad as that is, that price will be doubled or tripled in the next couple of years if we ignore her much longer. Just a few months ago, the world's population passed 7 billion people. 7 billion people. Scripture tells us, and other prophecies tell us, that 1/3 to 2/3 of the entire population of mankind will be wiped out in this war to come. I don't know what it takes to wake us up. Maybe we have to find it on NBC or CBS or some commentator in the New York Times before we finally take this seriously. And maybe we say to ourselves, we take it seriously, but I think we don't take it seriously enough. We have many priorities. Sometimes I wonder how I get through my day between what I'm supposed to do today, between getting up and doing my reading, doing my other work, talking to people that God wants me to talk to and so forth. And we only all have 24 hours a day. And I'm sure that my life is not as busy as the bishops and the Pope. But we must make this priority number one. There is nothing more serious, nothing more important, nothing more urgent than Our Lady's message at Fatima. And this is something that I don't know how to say. I remember getting a letter from an older bishop many years ago. I think he was in Ottawa. And he said to me basically in his letter, "Father Gruner, if you would not raise your voice so much, if you would not yell at us, we might start paying attention to you." And I wrote back to him and I said, "I appreciate very much your interest and your concern and your advice. Now, if you can tell me how I can do that any better than what I'm doing and get the attention, I'd be very happy to do it. I hate yelling at people. I hate raising my voice, and I hate trying to draw attention to myself. But there's no other way around on this message. If there's something more important, and certainly yesterday we were in this March for Life here in Rome, and the number of people that are killed by abortion since about 1975, by the statistics we looked up, is about 1,300,000 people. And by war, there's another 78 million people. And then by government murder, not only in Russia and China, but other parts of the world, 238 million people. These are catastrophic, and they lead us to think that we are, as Pope Pius XII, rather Pius X, St. Pius X said, that we are in the days just before the coming of the Antichrist. These things that are happening to us, which Pope Benedict, when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, said, that refer to this Fatima message is found in sacred scripture, that we are living the times of the apocalypse. And although we can be distracted with everything from daily newspapers to new movies or whatever else it is that entertains us, these things are happening around us, and they're happening every day. And they're happening in such a way that how can we deny that we're living in, if it's not the apocalypse, if it is not the time coming before the Antichrist, it is the best, shall we say, preview or event which the world has never seen before. Just looking at the Catholic Church, for example, the only other time in church history that comes close to this time is the Arian crisis, when 90% of the bishops were Arian. And there was only about 3 or 4 bishops who actually stood up, and the greatest of them all, St. Athanasius, was actually excommunicated by the Pope in 357 AD. Now, he wasn't really excommunicated because, as the Church has always recognized, as St. Thomas points out, that law is not something that just the legislator says. Law is the ordination of reason. It is for the common good. And as the Church law to this day points out, that no one can be punished if he doesn't commit a crime. So because Athanasius was standing up for the faith, because he was defending the faith, which was his duty to do, he could not be punished even if the Pope pronounced a sentence of excommunication. In fact, Liberius regretted his action, but Liberius is the first pope not to be canonized from the time of St. Peter to the year 357. It's well for us to remember then that we need not be afraid of the judgments of men if we are on the right side of God. It's a principle that we need to keep in mind. We also have to understand that prophecy is a function in the church. It's a function that will never go away. It's a function that must be respected, just as the apostolic offices must be respected. As St. Paul tells us in Ephesians, the church is built upon the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, not just the apostles. The role of prophecy is essential. Scripture tells us that we must not extinguish the Spirit. We must not despise prophecy, but we must test all things and hold fast that which is good. So that is why I've promoted the message of Fatima, not only because it's unique among all the messages, but of course it's been approved by the Church. As Father Joseph St. Marie pointed out here in Rome, he was the one who wrote the speech for the Pope in 1982 when he went to Fatima. Father Joseph St. Marie points out that it is the role of the hierarchy to judge, to test whether the prophet speaks the truth. But once the hierarchy recognizes that the message comes from God, then the Pope himself and the bishops are bound to obey, not the prophet, but God who speaks through the prophet to them. That obligation is primordial. That is not for us to say, I'm telling the Pope what to do. No, but Our Lady of Fatima is telling him what to do. All I do is explain what it means. I answer the objections of theologians or others who haven't had the time to think about it. So when we get back to 1917, Our Lady comes. She comes and gives a message to show mankind the way to peace. She was asked, she was insisted that she come. She comes and she explains. And then for the next 95 years, we basically ignore her. So our Lord himself, in 1931, explained to the Pope and the bishops a lesson from history. He said, "Make it known to my ministers, given they follow the example of the King of France, in delaying the execution of my command, like the King of France, they will follow him into misfortune." What is that example he's talking about, the King of France? On the 17th of June, to the very day, the 17th of June, 1689, our Lord spoke to St. Margaret Mary and told her to tell the King of France to consecrate France to the Sacred Heart. Now the kings of France, there were 3 of them from that day, all ignored St. Margaret Mary's prophecy and our Lord's command through St. Margaret Mary. Even during her lifetime, St. Margaret Mary was known as a saint. She was well hidden, but her reputation for sanctity was well known among her contemporaries. And so, for them to ignore this, they paid with their lives. On the 17th of June, 1789, that's 100 years later to the day, the King of France was stripped of his authority by the Third Estate. 3 weeks later, the French Revolution, the storming of the Bastille. On the 20th or 21st of January, 1994, his head was cut off by the soldiers of the Revolution. And our Lord makes reference to this and says, "Make it known to my ministers, given they follow the example of the King of France, in delaying the execution of my command, like him, they will follow him into misfortune." Up until now, basically, the popes and the bishops around him have ignored, have delayed, have had one excuse after another. I think I've heard them all. And as we've had proven at these conferences before, none of those excuses really hold water. There is really no excuse for not doing it. However, that is not their choice up to now. And so we have a choice here. Of course, none of us are the Pope. None of us can command the Pope. Only he has the authority to command in the church himself or others, all the rest of the church. But we are not without resources. We will talk about this in another conference. But it's not just for the Pope. As the Pope himself, speaking at Fatima 2 years ago, said, "What is foretold in the secret is the passion of the church." And yes, there's a persecution of the Pope, but the Pope is within the church. And so it's not just the Pope that suffers the passion coming up, but it is the church also.